Each sentence is a leaf that floats, and each breath you draw will carry you out of waking thought into the slow heart of myth and memory where stories are not told, but unroll like clouds or tides or dreams that never had names. This is all the history of Greece, gods and myths told quietly and slowly through the still hours, so you can sleep while time creeps into the soft, dark corners of the creating of creation, where the world was not yet made, and the sky was not yet colored, and the gods themselves waited quietly like seeds, sleeping deep inside untouched ground. Now drift further with me into the quiet spaces of the ancient world, where time itself seemed shaped by breath and wind by bells, and grain by dawn's rise, and the stars fall, where the holy days were not moments to be remembered, but living presences felt in the bones, and intuited in the heart, where even the simplest acts of life were done under the light touch of something old and invisible, such as a hand resting lightly on the shoulder, such as a voice speaking softly from the edges of silence. Long before Zeus took hold of the thunder, or Poseidon stirred the seas prior to Apollo, as Lighting or Hades claimed his dominion, before there existed form or face or name. Among any god, there was just the great deep emptiness vastness. Gaia, the earth herself, vast and long, patient and full of quiet strength, expansive and spreading out to form the space, where rest is to be found for all things to be a mother still dreaming, but not yet awake. Gaia came others just as expansive and strange Uranus, the sky who would eventually blanket himself over her like a shroud of stars, and Pontus the sea, whose voice would be quieter than that of the gods themselves, and Nyx, the night who would watch in the hours when even the Titans slumbered. These were not gods as we would come to define them, but forces and forms shaped like that which would be but not born as we are born, existing instead. Like concepts made flesh, a gentle whirl of soil and air, a trembling of shadows and profound time, when body and heaven were not yet divided, and the future hung like fog on tranquil water, awaiting its initial ripple to break its stillness. Of movement, and slowly, with no rush and no sound, the first truths of the cosmos began to rise, not as commands or laws, but as rhythms gentle as the breath, the rise and fall of presence and absence, light and dark, sea and land, sleep and waking. And from these patterns everything that came after arose, including the very gods, themselves slow and motionless, and heavy with weight that was of old. Great empty gaping space, a place without form, without sound, without fire, nor sea nor land, just sheer endless possibility, rolled in the slow dark folds, which they named chaos. Not a storm nor a fury, such as we conceive of the word now to shatter the stillness, but of nothing waiting for the first breath. Of the world as the dawn arises not in clamor, but in the first change of color, the soft rising out of shadow, and from this change sprang yet asleep with a darkness that does not frighten. Way rock waits for fingers to shape it, the way a name waits to be spoken, not rushed, not shoved, just waiting old and still and sacred, waiting for air. At the very beginning long, they remind us that out of chaos, something began to stir, not quickly, not brutally, but as the tide slowly recedes or the weight settles deep in the roots. And from the same mouth that had brought forth, the world at that time was not to be walked or constructed or breathed. It was not stone or stream or mountain, but a vision only just starting to assume its form. And yet, even then there was a balance, a soft leaning towards order, as if the chaos itself yearned for form, as if silence longed for song and stillness dreamed. Then allow your body to remain here, in this beginning prior to thunder, prior to war, prior to names carved into marble or recited in temples. Permit yourself to drift above the broad, slow bed of a world. And in that endless slow dream, the first things waited. They did not move. They did not speak, but they existed and waited the way earth waits for rain, the sieve. They bore many children to each other, And they were not small or quiet. They were strong and strange. Some with 100 arms able to make or destroy at a moment's notice, and others with 50 heads who saw the world in fragments. The Cyclopes were among them single-eyed giants, not yet the later monsters of myth, but ancient artisans, whose eyes could penetrate stone, and whose hammers would eventually shape thunder itself. And then there were the Titans, 12 giant beings, who were the embodiment of natural order and rhythm, time and sea and remembrance and shining light, and the steady weight of things that last. But Uranus the sky began to fear his children, not because they had threatened him with arms or rebellion, but because they filled the world with shape and sound and wanting. And so in terror, he did not cast them out, but pushed them down far into Gaia herself, into her belly, the earth becoming not only mother but prison. The weight of such sorrow increased too much, and Gaia, who bore everything quietly, began to move with something new, not love or care, but resistance, the grinding slow of stone. Beneath her skin, she made herself a knife of flint, not made of metal, but of will sharpness, and gave it to Cronus, her son, the youngest of the Titans, who was not strongest, but willing to wait for the right moment. Cronus lay in wait beneath the folds of heaven, and when Uranus again came near to stretch across the earth, his son reached out, and with one motion of silence severed the rule of the sky. The blood of Uranus flowed, and from it more animals were bred, not pure or sweet, but fierce, the Furies, the giants, and the ash tree nymphs, all spouting from savagery like mushrooms after a storm. Cronus reigned not over men, but over order and cycle and golden time, a reign in which things moved in cycles, and the world went round without hunger. But he himself was not exempt from fear, for it was spoken in his ears, as it had been spoken in Uranus, that one day his own offspring would rebel against him, and depose him as he had deposed his father. Thus Cronus swallowed every child of Rhea, born to him whole, not in wrath, but in quelling determination, still clutching time in himself, so nothing might change, but to the secret places of the earth, and there with Gaia. As assistance she gave birth to her 6th child in secret. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon all swallowed down into the black heat of their father's belly, and the world was still, as if breathing itself were stopped. But Rhea wept, and in weeping she did not go to the heavens. She wrapped a rock in swaddling clothes, and brought it to Cronus, who took it without inspecting it, and swallowed it, thinking the future had been wrapped up and sealed forever. The baby had been hidden in a cave on the island of Crete, where the noise of dripping water was louder than predicting, and the noise of goatskin. Blankets drowned the result, and when the time came, he returned not in battle, but by cunning. His name was Zeus, and he grew up not with Titans' power, but with shadow-born ingenuity. He heard thunder and learned its beat. And his brothers and sisters were freed one at a time, not as infants, but as full-grown gods, ready to take their place, nourished body and soul by the nymphs, and fed by the goat Amalthea, his cradle gently rocked by the Curetes, who banged their swords and shields to quiet him from the ears of the sky. Zeus did not rush his destiny. He grew up like a tree, learning first the wind, then moving out from under the canopy. He gave Cronus a draught that made the old god retch up all he had. Swallowed, they had a war waged not due to want, but necessity. The Olympians against the Titans, not due to greed, but to return the world to breath and balance and voice. They fought for 10 long years, rocking the mountains and bubbling the seas, until Gaia herself breathed unto Zeus that victory would not be theirs without the strength of the forgotten ones. And so he descended into Tartarus and freed the 100-handed ones, the Hecaton Shires and the Cyclopes, whom in gratitude they gave in thunder and lightning and the storm forge. Tales would echo in marble and temple, in poem and prophecy, and in the minds of those who dared to wonder who shaped the stars, beyond reach of justice. With these he defeated the Titans, not to death, but to deep oblivion shut within the underworld, pits behind gates and walls and time itself. Cronus was overthrown, not by fire, but by silence, and the world was new again. A world in which the sky did not fear the earth, and in which gods walked like men. Zeus took the sea for his own and his brothers. Poseidon and Hades drew lots for the sea and underworld, and their sisters sat on thrones of grain and hearth and marriage. A new order began, not perfect, not peaceful, but introduced the Olympians to the midst of a world. They would now speak and remember and cry and laugh. And above all, they would not be forgotten for there. But while Olympus rose in pillars and clouds, the shadows of elder things still hung, the fates weaving silently. Behind the thrones of the gods, the Furies cowering in the corners. And somewhere deep in the earth belly, Gaia still turned slowly, her heart still burdened with all her children, her breath steady, her silence full. The gods might rule from above, but the origin of all stories still curled below them, muttering, "Not yet, not over, not ever." And in every temple, in every grove, in every prayer, murmured at dusk, there was left the murmur of chaos, the earliest silence waiting again to be sound. The world-is breath is still forming a slow exhalation from a mouth yet to be formed in the hush before time. Begins the universe unfolds like warm honey across a flat and barren plain. No voice has yet whispered the word light. No foot has yet stepped into earth. No eye has yet opened in wonder. And so in this emptiness without memory, the first trembling comes not with thunder, but with an almost palpable hum, a low vibration that drifts through the endless dark. This hum begins to thicken, to gather into itself, not sound, but intention, a silent pressure curling inward upon itself, like a seed implanting itself in nothing, and from this motion, from this gravitational pull, arises the oldest creature of all, not born, not created, not named in the way that we understand, but simply is and vast the primordial void called chaos. Not chaos in the way of disorder, as we might imagine, but a yawning space, an open mouth wide enough to contain the stirrings of all that would one day be. But companion to light, the refuge where light retires together, they curl around the edges of chaos, like a promise of cycles to come, of day and night, of waking and sleeping, of motion and rest. And from these presences, others begin to emerge without birth, without fanfare, each more subtle, each more complicated than the last, like a song adding harmony. With each breath, chaos does not stir like living organisms stir, but it opens a little at a time, like the edge of a dream meeting the world awake and out of its infinite folds. A presence of space and breath, he does not fall, but comes to rest upon her gigantic and radiant, and she receives him, and in this silence she plots not in cruelty, but in restoration. She forges a sickle of impenetrable stone and offers it to her youngest Titan son, Kronos, not as a weapon, but as an act of severance. And when Uranus' blood as it falls to the earth, new beings spring forth, not children, but results, the Erinyes, the Furies. Allure her presence is not passive but tidal. She moves through the creating world, not with desire, but with invitation. Things begin to lean toward her, birds, flowers, songs. All begin to take shape because of her gaze. And so she walks through the world that is still reaching into itself, like the warm wind before a storm born of injustice, with eyes that never close and wings that carry the scent of old sorrow, and the giants strange and tall, and the Malaya ash tree nymphs, whose presence is as quiet as falling leaves, and from the sea, where the rest of Uranus comes to rest, comes something milder, stranger, as the new world and the old prepare to battle, not for blood, not for territory, but for shape, for the very structure, their single unwavering eye. And when they ally themselves with Zeus, they bring not only force but sight. The Cyclopes hammer out thunderbolts from quietness' arms. They hum with the resonance of sky and time, and one by one the Titans begin to fall, not in death, but in imprisonment. Of being the Titans with their extent, and the gods with their purpose, face each other across the ridge of time, and the conflict that follows will rage. 10 years not measured in days, but in revolutions of the heavens and the ache of stone. A sea foam aglow, a shape next falls to her, she opens, and Kronos rises and cuts the sky from the earth in one slow motion. Not bloody, not violent, but complete of their fall, the gods build a new home. A new height, a mountain, not of rock, but of existence. Olympus, the navel of the world, not because it is high. Myths begin to unfold stories that are not answers, but explorations of hunger, of hope, of vengeance, of love, and in their laughter and in their rage. The world still turns, but because it is middle, and from it they begin not to rule, but to weave, but as recollections of chaos, as vows kept, as testaments to a world still growing, still dreaming, not in love, but in necessity. Their embracing is not gentle, but inevitable. Sky and earth embracing without arms, and from this embracing comes life in its earliest and most ancient forms. He presides as rivers find their courses, as mountains rise from the back of the earth, and in time he finds a mate, Rhea, who moves with rhythm and with grace, becoming what Uranus had become, a father devoured by his own children. And so when each child is born, he opens his mouth wide and swallows them whole, not in hate, but in fear. Rhea weeps each time. She holds an empty cradle in her arms, until at last she hides. One child, Zeus, wrapping him in cloth and giving Kronos a rock instead, and the child is taken away to a cave to be raised in secret, with nature's fierce cries as his lullaby, and together they give rise to a new generation, children not titans, not yet gods, but something else more finite, more bound by feeling, by choice, rises. Not as a warrior, but as a returning echo, he finds his father, and with a draught of magic and of memory, Kronos opens his belly, and the swallowed siblings come out blinking and whole, and together they start to move not as children, but as storm. Start to emerge new beings old, now only because they were the first to appear. Gaia, the earth forms not as a planet, not yet with rivers or mountains of full. What is to come? Time and order and rhythm. There is Okinos, the river that circles the world like a hoop of breath, and Hyperion, the light that will one day delineate the dawn, and Themis, the law that is not commanded, but felt known in the bones, like the fact of seasons or the ache of hunger in Kronos. Time itself, with his grinding slowness and eyes that never sleep. So low it cannot be touched, a presence that bears the weight of gravity itself. He is not darkness, he is density, a sort of holy stillness below, huge and strong. And then the Cyclopes, one-eyed smiths, whose vision is narrow but deep, each child a piece of the world to be. But Uranus sees them not as gifts, but as threats, and begins to push them back into the body of the earth, a return not to nourish, but to imprisonment. And Gaia weeps without a sound her sorrow, seeping into the roots of mountains. One falls into its own nature, filling the great open silence with its presence. And then from the growing edge of chaos comes Nyx night. Her presence is velvet and boundless, not horrific, but enfolding. She is not the absence of light, but the place where dreams are made. She wraps herself around the forming world like a mantle, soft and slow, and entire the floor of the cosmos, and soon above them both shapes Eros, desire, not as passion or desire, but as the force that pulls things together, the yearning between stars and soil, between warmth and form, between what is and what might be, but as the idea of ground itself, a vast awareness of form and mass and stillness. She does not yet speak, but her presence is heavy and low, like the feeling of roots, developing in silence. And with Gaia comes Tartaros, not hell, not punishment, not fire, but depth pure and endless, a chasm, as these ancient presences unravel. They do not behave as mortals. There is no conversation, no conflict, no longing. Yet each with Nyx is Erebus' dark shadow, not evil. Gaia stirs not in movement, but in intent, and from her stillness she bears Uranus. The sky, not the blue dome of daytime, but the boundless ceiling of being. He is above her, leaning without weight. 12 children are born first. The Titans, not gods, not men, but forces old and huge. They are the framework. Gaia continues to give birth to children, gruesome to our eyes, but vital to the shape of the world. There are the 100-handed ones, creatures. The pain becomes pressure. The pressure becomes anger from Uranus. From this foam is born Aphrodite, not yet love, not yet beauty, but the first blossoming of Kronos appropriates. The sky is his own, and does not rule from a throne, but from the wheel of time itself. But Kronos fears what he is. He fears in this cave Zeus does not grow quickly, but deep he sucks on sacred goats. He plays with bees and storms cluster round him, like curious pets, and when he is powerful, the earth trembles not in fear, but in anticipation. And in the quiet moments of that war, other beings appear not to fight, but to witness the hecaton shires, the 100-handed. The Cyclopes with Kronos is not chained, but bound by time, incarcerated in Tartaros. The deepest pit and the other titans are scattered, some to wander, some to sleep, and from the echo, the gods are not perfect. They are not distant. They are characterized by longing, by lack, by awe. They do not govern the world, they interact with it, dance with it, fall into it, and from their footsteps. And as night falls again over the primitive world, the stars sparkle, not as light. The ancient Thales still unfold themselves beneath a sky so vast and boundless, stretching far beyond hills that rise and fall as if in the slow panting of the earth herself, in still seas whose waves break softly against forgotten shores here. The first uncertain whisperings of the Olympian gods begin to take form. Kronos, the troubled father who held transient moments with trembling hands, afraid of the concealed future, the immortal. Gaia Mother Earth, whose boundless patience protected the source of all existence deep in the ground. And Oceanus, the boundless sea encircling the earth in a gradual comforting embrace that carried the mysteries of unseen depths to the eyes of men. Born of the dying shadows of Titans, who long ago reigned over the earth, the heavens in the vast boundless ocean depths where chaos went unchecked and time had no measure but the slow breathing of the world as it spun and spun under the watchful gaze of silent stars. But deeply human in their feelings and flaws, their immortal lives weaving a dance of light and shadow, casting the rhythm of seasons, the turn of years, and the soft stories told beside the flight of candles on desolate dark nights, fate binding gods and mortals in endless grasp, a tapestry of silent wonder and unchanging fluidity, whose threads are still uttered softly by breezes passing over hills, and present intertwined like roots growing deep in the earth their Thales, carried gently in hearts they are willing to pause, listen, and be carried along on the quiet river of timeless myth and valleys of sacred lands. And life the troubled wind bears Artemis' footsteps, varying in uncultivated lands. Apollo's eternal light shades the long afternoons, and Athena as hidden wisdom glows in the moving leaves of fall. The sea as infinite hymn buzzes. Human and divine the stones worn by time report hushed petitions and forgotten rituals, the sacred groves, still perfume with light presence of gods who live between minutes. The windy breath of the fleeting air, the slow fall of dusk, the soft twinkle of stars before morning, Poseidon's power-shaping coastlines in stirring hidden depths. Hades' shadow rests in the quiet earth, where stories lie hidden, waiting to be stirred, and waymaking to a new pantheon of gods, whose lives were forever entwined with the fate of mortals, whose stories resonated as faint footsteps. Across ancient land, Zeus, the great sky father, whose lightning lay concealed behind his peaceful voice, standing at Olympus' summit, watching all quietly calling forth his brothers and sisters by the swift and untamed. Artemis with bow drawn, and ready to shield the unentered places, the radiant Apollo, who carried steady light in his hands, the soft hope of understanding, and the gentle promise of futures, yet to become whispering softly across the ages like a boundless breeze. And the wise Athena, who sprang fully armed from her father's mind, carrying gifts of wisdom, strategies, and unobtrusive power. The mighty Titans controlled all that was great and ancient, their names called forth, like religious mantras that recall old memories buried in the earth, and heaven's bones. And Harvest and Hades ruled the silent depths of the underworld, where souls traveled past the light, all summoned together in harmony, woven out of power mystery and quiet moments enfolding gods in the hearts of men and women, across the ancient world. Time's slow transition smoothed the mighty rule of the Titans, their strength waning like the fading colors of the evening. Poseidon, turbulent lord of the sea, agitated the waves with his mighty trident, creating shores and storms. Both Demeter nurtured the earth, tending the cycles of growth. These gods did not live far away from us, in locations inaccessible, but in the rustling leaves of sacred woods, in the soft lowing of waters slowly flowing through the earth, and the quiet, moving shadows cast by ancient stones, where time itself was slow, and the very breath of the gods could be felt touching the world, gently unknown, but stirring the heart, stirring the imagination to the timeless dance of life and death, and all between. Their love, jealousy, wrestles with mercy, betrayal, and forgiveness became the ever-present heartbeat of a people who saw in these myths a reflection of their own hopes, fears, and struggles. The gods were not distant, flawless beings. As the old world retreated gradually, the new world rose out of mythic embers of memory. The halls of Olympus resounded with laughter and weeping, and the slow rhythm of in the quiet among the stars in the spaces where dreams drift softly like clouds. There is a quiet history, a soft breathing of worlds past. The ancient gods do not shout, but their voices continue in smallest moments. The touch of cool air, the glint of light upon water, the faint whisper of old melodies, but never forgotten, for they still exist in the eternal night under the stars. A soft lullaby song of old voices calling to us gently to recall, to dream, and to sleep. Beneath the vast sky, the gradual turning seasons carry traces of those early existences. The spring blooms vibrate, Demeter's still gift of rebirth. Across the rolling hills, the soft whisper of rivers recalls the tread of 1,000. The stories contain lessons veiled in ambiguity, such as soft cloth folds thrown across the shoulders of history. Lessons of balance between strength and mercy, of the gossamer strands that tie all living. Beings of the thin line between chaos and order that makes the world stable. These tales encourage quiet reflection, a deep breath, a slow turning inwards into the stillness where old truths wait to be unearthed. The canvas of men and gods stretches out into eternity, beyond the vision of eyes or the understanding of minds. Living tapestry embroidered of endless stories, each thread glowing softly with meaning, each bow trellised with secrets sung from mother to child, born lightly in the lullabies. Sung in the fireside warmth, the words whispered softly, as sleep rises like a soft tide through the kingdoms. Even now the old names breathe beneath the surface of the world in the silent spaces between heartbeats, in the turn of a page, in the fading light of evening, in the steady rhythm of the seasons calling out to those who listen, to remember the old ways, to honor the mysteries, and to know peace within the unnumbered unfolding story of all things. These deities once walked among mortals in the dance of myth and history, shaping fates and spinning futures. Their stories an endless river that flows across time, carrying with it the rise of Olympus and the enduring supremacy of the 12. But Olympus it breathes like the earth itself, its great halls opening not by doors, but by silence, with golden paths that shine in morning mist, where gods tread lightly between thought and thunder, and the winds that sweep round its summits bear not clouds, but whispers the distant songs of oracles, and the rumor of prayers rising from temple stones worn to silk by centuries of men's desires. Zeus' throne does not tower over in fear, but stands firm as a center, as a stillness around which everything moves. His presence, the eye of the storm and the peace after sentence. His wrathfulness not but inevitable, like rain on earth where earth parches for too long, and even his rage when it comes is conditioned by the need of return, by the quiet justice that even gods must abide by the hurt. And Hephaestus doesn't speak much, but when he does, an altering, but never finishing every myth. A cycle, every fall a start, every triumph balanced on the edge of another trial. The stars over their realm not distant. An action between lament and comfort. The gods do not speak to them in word, but in feeling, in wind and flame, in sorrow and praise, in the unexpected still of the world before anything is. irretrievably altered suns but indolent lookers each, one a burning eye carrying witness to all that has ever been conceived or done. The room shifts a bit under the weight of what is built, what is broken, and what still remains secret in the radiance of the hammer. Thus light of Zeus, the beauty sought in poetry and drama, murmuring with the sorrow of Aphrodite spun on looms, they cannot perceive their dreams entangled by immortal threads. Their children born under stars that glint with meaning even the most ordinary things. The lighting of a flame, the breaking of bread, the tilling of earth, are echoes of Olympus, fleshed out acts of worship, spoken in life more than in words, and all loves, all joys, all sorrows. A prayer tossed heavenward, whether known or not, in the fury of Ares and always. Athena observing through the thoughts behind the thoughts. Underneath him the court does not argue, but pulses with the weight of being each god radiating in their way, aglow not with light, and in the pool deep of Olympus. The face of humanity looks back in godlight, faulted, and shining, ever spreading, ever returning, always becoming something just beyond the horizon of knowledge, always circling the mountain, always singing the names, inscribed on sky, altars marked by not sacrifice alone, but hope and loss and awe. The holy groves is places where the skin of the world thaws thin, and the breath of Olympus may be felt caressing gently over the soul, like the wings of Hermes brushing in the twilight, but with sense. Artemis with a crescent of shadow cast across her brow, Apollo with dawn always reaching towards his fingertips, Athena has shield flashing with concept yet unspoken, and Poseidon stealing long, slow glances out into the distance, as though hearing something awakening deep beneath the waves. Both of them speak seldom, but when they do, the voice is a river, now put into words, the stream of purpose in the form of breath. Hestia listens silently, unmoving, a steady fire drenching heat on the room, while Hermes blinks between thoughts, half-spoken laughter ever close to his presence. A dance between wisdom and mischief, between the road traveled and the untraveled one. Demeter has voiced the slow comeback of spring, her words verdant with promise and bereavement. Ares wets the edges of stillness with every glance and tone. Aphrodite brings the stillness before the initial kiss, before the plummeting, before time doesn't move in. Olympus as it does down there, because here, memory and future are like dawn and dusk, the stories that give the gods their definition repeating. And still the people below live by contact with these invisible presences. They do not see Olympus, but feel it in the stillness, before harvest in the trembling leaves, before tempest in the interlude between choice. The temples rise tall out of stone, not to hold them, but to hold remembrance, to shape space for the ache of something more that even the cities reverberate with divine echo in the rhythm of streets that mirror constellations in the hands of statuary, chiseling stone into faces that gaze not outward, but inward to something deeper, older, the laws asserted in forums resonating with the justice. Mortals dance with the gods not knowing their lives. In the grand festivals when the throng arrives and singing mounts to the twilights, the gods are closest not as spectators, but as presence as the flame between poems and the quiver of voices. Mounted to chant Dionysus though, not of the 12 dances through the orgy, his ghost radiant in laughter, in release in the unbecoming of the self and other of the now, and then the sacred confusion that reminds that living too must overflow. He moves across the threshold. Other men fear, intoxicated not with wine, but with the truth that smolders beneath masks, beneath reason, beneath the rational facade. And here, too, he is God, a reminder that the gods are not only control, but liberty, not alone order, but liberty from order, the unlocking of the soul, so that something real may pour out in song, in tears in the silence. That follows joy. And so Olympus still unruffled, but ageless its summits reached not through rising, but through recollection, through withdrawing, and rising together through following roads that begin in fantasy and end in legend, where the stories exist not in pages, but in bone, in breath, in the spaces, when life is abruptly more, and the world for a moment appears to glow with meaning. There are no endings here, but cycles the gods do not die, but return again and again, their presence shifting like the seasons, like uninvited. Thoughts the Olympians are not bound in the past, but carried forward by blood, by song, by the flame that still burns where the stories are heard, where the names are spoken, where a child hears a story and wonders if perhaps it might be so. The stars on Olympus move slowly, not to mark time, but to mark it gently, like Hera marks the shape of home, like Demeter marks the rhythm of the seed, like Hestia marks the center of the flame they burn, not the blind, but to illuminate the way, reminding everyone who looks up that the heavens are full, and not empty, full of voices, full of footsteps, full of the quiet dignity of gods, who move unseen through the living world. And so the 12 are always themselves, but never stationary, not fixed in marble, but moving like river water down the decades, each myth a ripple, each prayer a drop. And so it was in the shaking web of myth and time the gods of Olympus did not merely reign above. They walked upon the hills and the woods, all along the shores of distant isles, and through the dusty streets of cities, whose names long since were swallowed by the sea. They gazed into kings' hearts and spoke to shepherds' minds sometimes. Their voices were thunderclaps, and sometimes little more than a hush beneath the rustling grain. Mortals, for their part, did not merely worship the gods. They feared them, loved them, cursed them, tried to placate them with sacrifice, song and sculpture, temples carved by suffering hands over centuries, prayers mumbled into the emptiness before war or harvest. And all the while, a gossamer thread persisted. Mortals dreamed of the gods, and the gods, in their own immortal turn, dreamed of mortals too. Take, for instance, the tale of Semele, whose loveliness captured the eye of Zeus. She was neither queen nor noblewoman, but only a daughter refusing to let the earth bloom. The world dried up in winter and burst in spring when her daughter came back. This was how the ancient people explained the seasons, not as the turning of the earth, but as the grief of a mother deified. Among the stars, where he still roams the night sky, chased by her hounds of silver light of Thebes. Yet the king of gods descended unto her in disguise, cloaking his divinity in form, was not born from the womb, but from the foam of the sea. Where the severed flesh of Uranos fell foaming the waters into life, she burst. Wisdom legendary, she taught mortals how to build ships, how to weave cloth, how to read the sky for omens her city of. Athens testified to her benefactions, and there her statues glowed with oil lights, each night as offerings to her unyielding gaze free from his love, begged the earth to save her, and was transformed into a laurel. Tree her leaves still used to crown poets in his name. Forth radiant and inescapable, and despite being wedded to the forge god Hephaestus, she hungered for passion, and found it in the arms of Ares, god of war, their tryst hidden behind drapes of fog. Hestia, the quiet goddess of the hearth, never left Olympus, whose flame burned in each home where meals were consumed and stories shared. She asked no temple, no conflict, only recollection and warmth. Hermes, the troublemaker, quick as air protector of travelers and thieves, both his sandals winged. His tongue silver, he traveled between worlds, conveying messages, secrets, and occasionally souls themselves to the underworld. And mystery, until Hephaestus entangled them in a golden net and shamed them before the gods. But even so, the force of love was greater than the hold of law. And out of their union were born children as wild and fierce as the flame. But in the remote valleys of Mount Nysa, amidst the nymphs and ivy, his laughter one day, ringing out upon the boards of Athens, his presence in every cup lifted for joy or forgetfulness, and cut their names in stone, wrote their epics in verse, presented honey and figs, and the first fruits of the harvest in anticipation. The gods might see, and sometimes they did, and sometimes they did not. But then he did not know. Yet the grief of a life lost and a new one started that she could safely behold. But the human mind is apt to be deceived by curiosity and jealousy. Hera, the jealous wife of Zeus, deceived Semele into demanding Zeus to show himself unto her in his full true form. And when he did so, The very radiance of lightning and divine presence killed her where she stood, leaving behind but only the unborn child in her womb. From that ash was born Dionysus, god of wine, madness, ecstasy, and theater, a god born of human and divine, raised not among the Olympians. Many gods had similar tales of pining, which extended the boundaries of immortality, and time tales in which gods wept as humans, wept loved as fiercely, and lost as profoundly. There was Demeter, the goddess of grain, whose daughter Persephone had been taken by Hades to the underworld for half the year. Demeter mourned. And Artemis, swift and untamed protector of maidens and beasts, both who in bygone times cherished a man by the name of Orion. Unparalleled hunter, some say he was brother to her in warfare. Others say she cherished him till a joke of fortune, an arrow loosed too soon, ended his life, and thus she placed his shape. Love in Olympus was never straightforward. Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty herself. The gods warred, dined, plotted, and sported, but even they knew hierarchy and order. Zeus ruled by lightning, but consulted his brothers and sisters on council. Poseidon ruled the sea, but yielded to Hades, who kept the dead in their quiet cities below the 12. Olympians each wielded power not just over the elements, but over emotion and dream and the laws of nature. Themselves, they were not so much a family as a tempest of power, perpetually shifting, yet eternally stationary. Athena, the fighting goddess who was born from Zeus' head, came forth full panoplied, with no mother, her eyes sharp as spearheads her. To her half-brother Ares, though, was the insanity of war, all bone and blood and screaming steel, where Athena's as war was strategy and justice. His was flames and rage. He was less revered and more feared his temples, echoing with the screams of sacrifice and the scent of iron. Apollo, golden-haired twin sister to Artemis, god of music, god of prophecy, and god of the sun itself, with his lyre. He sang the world to light with his arrows. He struck disease, or cured it, his oracle at Delphi spoke in riddles that kings journeyed, mountains to hear, but even he was not beyond sorrow, for he fell in love often and lost often more, the nymph Daphne, desperate to be. Thus did the gods feel this pining. They would be unable to rid themselves of, since immortality doesn't stop a person from mourning it, only stretches it out over endless centuries, like the tired clashing of a bell heard continuously, but never repeated. Each god symbolized something vast, but also something inherently human. And then lame and scarred Hephaestus, the smith-master of flame, and forge his hands never ceasing to move, shaping gold into chains and bronze, into armor, his loneliness unstated, but poured into every flawless curve of his work. And thus on Olympus the 12 governed, not always in harmony, not always in peace, but in equilibrium, each flame igniting the others, each voice a reflection in the chorus of the ages. The mortals below looked up. But whether heard or unheard, silent or unseen, loved or feared, the gods remained ever in the background behind. The rain in the dance of fire, in the stillness before the storm, in the rustle of leaves where no wind blew. And their stories were told over and over again, until memory became myth, and myth the breath of the world. So it came to pass that the Kronos children occupied the lofty rock throne of Olympus, not in haste or ambition for rule, but as those summoned by a rhythm older than the world itself. Zeus seated in the center with storm cloud eyes and a voice that rumbled like distant thunder was not alone, because beside him stood Hera, radiant in her stillness, with a look that weighed each heart. And beside her sat Poseidon, monarch of the salt foam and the bellowing tides and the waving kelp forests, where no sunlight ever entered, where shipwrecks slumbered and whales sang in slow, floating orbits, and the hum of bees in her voice, as if the wheat and the orchard waited in expectation of her hand. Demeter came unnoticed, with the scent of growing things in her hair, the quiet of green fields in her step. Athena arrived like the silent thought prior to the word, with the forge fire, purity, and olive tree, wisdom incised in stone, her radiant armor, although as yet no war called. Apollo arrived not in strides, but unfolding like the dawn itself with golden limbs. Outstretched over the sky, and the music of concealed lyres in every movement, a song waiting to be heard again. Artemis moved like a shadow made of starlight, her foot sweeping. Leaves not yet dropped, her fingers threaded with the quiet of the deep wood and the suspense of the hunt. Before dark of blood, before the wound, Ares was preceded by the scent of iron, not as a rage monster, but as the edge of will, the trembling in the hand before the strike, the taste, but of foam and longing, and the searing silence after the first touch, before words have a name. Hephaestus approached, bearing fire in his hands, walking slowly, as if the mass of mountains was wrapped in his bones, and all invention man ever imagined danced in his eyes. Aphrodite walked on air, like the sheen on still water, born neither of earth nor of sky. Hermes was last, his feet barely touching the surface of things, his laughter echoing between worlds, his fingers already weaving the handles of fate as he carried stories like a shepherd carries stars. And so the 12 sat not merely to rule, but to balance the trembling world, to stretch their essence through seasons and elements and the hearts of mortals, who whispered their names in sleep. But their reach was never only theirs alone, for Aphrodite's beauty fed the courage of Ares, and Hephaestus' anvil shaped the arrows of Artemis. They sat themselves not on thrones, but in currents and winds, in rivers and forests and hearths, in disputes and lullabies and fields, freshly plowed and cups freshly poured, whispered in the ears of farmers and builders and mothers, rocking sleeping infants in the summer heat. And the mountain Olympus, once rock and root and moss, now bore the heartbeat of something more, something tempered of myth and time, and the yearning of those below. For the gods had not only overthrown the Titans, they had overthrown the silence before story and filled it with shape, and sound and trembling, and wind and dream and silence. And in the trembling hands of those who shaped their stories in marble and in clay, and their rule was not a throne or a commandment etched in stone, but a series of echoes that rippled out into the chambers of the world on rain and thunder and harvest. Each god had a domain. Apollo, breath healed the wounds of conflict, and Athena's insight. I see you, I feel you. I remembered the sound of your voice in the distance between heartbeats. It was the rise of Olympus, not a palace, but a rhythm, not a kingdom, but a movement that ran through each fig leaf and each fireside, melody and each promise made beneath a full moon. Mortals did not see the gods with their eyes, but felt them in the weight of a choice and the taste of honey in the sudden stillness before the storm, when the world is holding its breath. They built temples not to house the gods, but to remember where the veil grew thin and the sky sounded clearer, and their prayers were not requests, memories, and so too did the gods not communicate in words, but in wave. Each statue was not merely an image, but a doorway, each one extending an invitation of a gesture to say. The Olympians did not watch from afar. They lived in the turning of the seasons, in the spill of wine, in the ache of longing, and the joy of rest just for existing. Their rule was not measured in law or battle, but in the way mortals turned their faces to the dying light and wondered, and in that wondering the gods were fed. Even Zeus' storms were not punishments, but reminders of the great breath that held all things together, of the sky's voice when it could no longer be still. And in the silence that followed came Hera's gentle restoration, the cool cloth on the fevered brow, the soft order returning to the disturbed table. Poseidon's waves taught the shore limit and yield in the way. A fisherman listens to tides, and a sailor reads. The stars with hands still sore from ropes and salt Demeter. Grain fed not only the belly, but the memory of warmth of family of hands breaking. Bread in silence of the comfort in known cycles, and the trust in return. Artemis guided the hunter not to pray, but to hear leaves whisper, and hearts beat, and paths fade, and reappear in moonlight. Apollo's songs stitched the rift between despair and beauty, made dawns brighter even when nights were dark, and his arrows of light forced ways through confusion. Hephaestus created not only tools, but destinies, bringing into existence the houses, the vessels, the cups, the lyres, the locks and keys that would shape generations. Aphrodite breathed into lovers' hearts, but also into mirrors and empty rooms, and midnight thoughts reminding mortals they were worthy of adoration. Hermes traveled markets and graves through laughter and goodbyes, along the knife edge of risk and the thrill of the unknown and the ache of what cannot be spoken. Ares was not merely war. He was the resilience to oppose. He was the pulse prior to protection, the trembling prior to refuge, the heat of staying alive. And Athena shaped not only battle plans, but peace plans of gardens wisely planted of truths, spoken softly of cities, built with tomorrow in mind. These gods were not distant. They were woven into bone and breath, and dreamed they rose with the dawn, and lay down beside the fire at night listening. And Olympus wasn't over the world. It was within it, moving through branches and footsteps and songs, and silent nods across tables. For the rule of the 12 was uncontrol, but presence not remoteness, but nearness, not dictation, but involvement in the great unfolding. And so the gods did not remain as kings on thrones, but as friends and witnesses forever alongside the stories that we live, even when we do not speak their names. The mountain did not stir, but it rang out, and in the ringing came warmth, memory, hope, and the subtle pressure of something watching with wonder and kindness. And in the golden silence that followed the fall of the Titans, the world began to breathe in a newer rhythm, softer and slower, as if the mountains themselves were sighing after an age of strain and conflict, and out of that great and sacred stillness came the reign of the 12, the ones now named. Olympians enthroned, not by right of birth alone, but by destiny, by strength, by infinite layers of memory and myth intertangled like threads on a loom. High on the shining throne of Olympus, Zeus held the sky not in pride, but in a vigil woven into his very being, for he had seen what power unleashed could do, what ambition unchecked could devour. And though his thunder was feared, it was also the sound of order rolling through the sky, like a shepherd's voice, holding chaos ever at bay. At his side, Hera moved like a veil in invisible wind, and yet shaping all she moved past her eyes, deep with knowing in her silence. Thicker than song, she who bore loyalty like armor and revenge, like perfume, walking always between the fire of her lord and the chill of betrayal protecting. Marriage not with love, but with law and judgment, like a queen tallying stars. For him in crashes and tides, in salt and foam and silence. And when his rage awoke, the earth itself remembered the old shudders that still slept concealed beneath stone. In the sea, Poseidon walked like a dream transforming in sleep, the waves rising and falling with the shiver of his trident and the beat of his heart. He had no need to speak much, for the sea spoke. And there was Demeter, her hands always on something that grew her heart, sown with sorrow, but fair his voice. Not harsh, but not kind, he was the sun, but the instant before sunrise, the instant when eyes shut against light and open to vision. His temples were not for worship alone, but for healing and harmony and hope. But by instinct, by the old blood heat that came before law, before justice, he walked, not only on battlefields, but in tempers and tension, in the clench of a fist and the set of a jaw. And though his name brought fear, it also brought the truth that strife was ever a part of the soul, that even peace. With hands that knew both pain and creation, his beauty wasn't in form, but in function, in how he kept. The world turning through craft and drudge and gleam was carved from war, but leapt out of the head of Zeus, fully formed, as if fate had no use for childhood. She walked through cities and council chambers, because they were gods, but they were also mirrors, their myths not so much tales, but truths carried in the blood, in the breath, in the turning of the seasons, in the rising of dreams and wrath, but in freedom. In the curve of a deer, the path of a moonbeam, the crack of a twig, her arrows flew without fury, only intent, and her devotees were those who listened more for wind than word, who understood that distance could also be devotion. Between words, he was there, and not there his voice, the whisper of trade, the hum of thieves, the final whisper of dying men and newborn babies alike. He moved between boundaries, not as an intruder, but as a guide, and he carried with him not just messages but meanings. truths too quick to speak truths that glided between silence and sound. And somewhere deep beneath the earth old roots stirred, as if remembering, as if expecting the beginning of the next. Song and empires leaned not in defeat, but in desire. Her power was not in body, but in longing in the way. It wrapped itself around thought and dream in the way. It changed kings and beggars with the same careless gaze. Her love was not always kind, but it was always true to itself. Not as rule alone, but as rhythm, as myth, wrapped in silence and breath and wonder armor, clicking softly like ideas against each other. And her eyes were always forward, always into what could be and flowering. Because she had known the joy of life and the agony of loss, she moved through the fields not as a figure but as a force, her breath in the wheat, her tears in the spring. And when she withdrew, the world grew still and frozen and bare, like a house without a fire. Athena sprang up like thought itself, chill and piercing, and created for war and wisdom. She was not born. Apollo walked in light, but carried shadow with him. His music a bridge between the seen, and the felt his arrows keen. Artemis remained in the forest, her footsteps unrecognized, not by her tread, but by the quiet that followed after she was untamed not. Ares was not reasoned, he was not created by thought. Aphrodite did not walk, she came like a wave that had always been there, like a feeling, remembered not found. She smiled. Hephaestus moved where others did in the noise of forge, in the shaping of flame. He spoke in hammer, strikes, and sparks. Each blow a sentence, each spark a story. He was hurled from Olympus, and yet he made Olympus possible. Hermes glimmered like a breath. Hestia was not the fire, but the hearth, the place where it sat. She asked no praise. She needed no temple, and yet she was there in every offering, every corner of every home, every family circle drawn. Her warmth was not fierce, but constant like the slow burn that holds the night away. She was peace not from weakness, but from refusing to use it loudly. And so Olympus was not a place, but a story being recounted over and over, a stage upon which the divine dramatized the discords and harmonies of humankind. The 12 were not single-minded, and their thrones, though mighty, were never still for even in eternity. There is motion, and the heart of Olympus beat, not as a single note, but in harmony, sometimes discordant, sometimes divine, but always alive, always echoing down into the world beneath. And the mortals beneath them gazed up not just in awe, but in reflection, for in the gods they saw not perfection, but power personified, not faultless. Rule but age-old story, repeating itself again and again, in lightning and laughter, in grief and refuge. Even during the time of the gods they changed, not in form, but in meaning, for each retelling renewed. Them each prayer retempered their cutting edge, each song rhymaged their legend, and thus they lived on, not as idols, but as shadows, moving just outside the fire, just behind the curtain. So the Olympus era was not one of silence, but of stories stored in the mouths of poets, and written on stone in temples, it's still warm, though abandoned, in names that last not because they must, but because they always do, like mountains' echoes, like footprints in the clouds. And the earth turned slowly beneath their gaze. The rivers still whispered, the winds still carried their names. And as the stars wheeled gently over Olympus as dreams, curled like mist from sleeping minds, the story of the 12 remained. Now the gods who dwelled on the summit of Olympus did not rule simply by brute force, nor by fear alone, but by intertwining their being with the world itself. They became presence and duration, and not merely power. The sky bore Zeus not merely above, within every tempest, within every peal of thunder that boomed through the valleys. And the mountains he was not a figure above the clouds, but an eternal heartbeat in the rhythm of the sky. Each bolt of lightning, a glimpse of his wrath, each rumble of thunder. Shadow, it was the quiet and unavoidable finale to every commencement, the final embrace beneath the earth that no one could escape. He did not cry out or rant, but waited in silence, collecting the souls of mortals and taking them not into torment, but into the progression of their journey. He was relentless, not brutal, patient, not icy, the silent final voice at the end of every life story. Rain was not war alone, not wisdom alone, but the ideal blend of both, a symbol of reason in a world too often ruled by passion. Her name was etched into city stones. Her concepts lived on in law strategies, defenses, but the structure of time itself, the rhythm of days, and the consistency of seasons, his lyre plucked harmonies that comforted empires, and his oracles spoke in riddled truth that settled destinies. He was clarity. But to be the embodiment of fury unchained, he was the heartbeat in the cacophony of war, the messenger, a thief and a guide. He touched both heaven and the underworld, both mountaintop and marketplace, no boundary held. Him no temple could fully contain him, for he lived in motion and in the laughter that echoed after mischief, in the whispered trade between merchants, in the final prayer whispered. As the soul crossed into Hades' domain, he was not rooted, and that made him eternal for motion. Does not decay, it only transforms scream beneath armor. The red mist that fell across vision and mind, he was not. So much revered as feared, but always present, always required, for where though the gods could not fully escape them, for, in doubting, they still uttered their names. The dominance of Olympus was not confined to temples. It extended to language, ritual, government, and the very framework of belief. It wasn't just 12 gods on a mountain. It was 12 infinite echoes that established the worldview of a whole civilization. And as the centuries went by, the gods endured, not because they demanded belief, but because their stories made sense, and sense, as all mortals know, is the one thing more durable than power. Daughter Persephone's fall, and rise they told all who worked field or garden, why the earth died or bloomed, why joy waxed and waned. Her sorrow was not just divine, but deeply human and in her cycles. The ancients felt a divine sympathy that knew pain and promised renewal. Was order there, would always break out conflict, and his shadow would lengthen. And mystery healer and harbinger, he stood at the crossroads of art and law, of prophecy and reason, and in his rays the cities of men found both vision and limit. His twin Artemis, by contrast, this conflict grew the mythos of Olympus, complex, layered, and long-lasting. They did not simply rule, they shaped how mortals perceived the divine, how they feared it, loved it, pleaded with it. These gods were not just beings aloof, but mirrors of humanity, as best and worst echoes of mortal desire, dressed in immortal action. And thus the dominance of Olympus was not a moment, but a state, an eternal becoming, an ascent, not marked by a single victory, but by the ongoing presence of these gods in every whisper of wind, every drop of ocean. Every flickering flame roamed far from the marble columns of towns and temples, preferring instead the whispering forest, the sacred glade, the place where the animal and divine still walked hand in hand. Her arrows were sharp, but so was her solitude. She represented a power inviolate by men, unmoved by cities. A reminder that divinity did not always wear crowns. His back bore wounds of rejection, but within those wounds was genius unmatched. He fashioned for the gods their weapons, their thrones, their dwellings in the clouds. His hammer struck not only with strength, but with suffering and determination. A god who labored, a god who bled for his art, who discovered beauty in fire and isolation. His flame never dwindled, not because it was never tried, but because it was endlessly fueled or carry scrolls. Sometimes it wore the silent hush of leaves, or the quiet before a hunt and buildings. She was not a goddess one called upon in crisis alone, but in every moment of rational thought, every reasoned argument, every plan written on papyrus or clay. She, to fleeting love or temporary lust, no, she was the goddess of union, of longing, of the suffering that drew mortals together and sometimes tore them apart. She ruled not only over the beds of lovers, but over the passions that burned inside solitary hearts. The beauty she aroused was not skin deep. It was the kind that empowered empires, that drove artists and drove kings to madness. She did not demand sacrifice in the same manner as Ares or Zeus, but instead demanded devotion by the desire. She stirred a hunger that knew no land or name, was the goddess of the mind in action, the heart restrained by higher order, while his brothers ruled the living Hades, had ruled over the fact that all living must one day return to silence and memory, and in this he had held sovereignty over poets, thinkers, and monarchs. Alike for death was the great equalizer, the dark mirror that reflected all triumph and failure alike. The echo of his might, so too was Hera no longer constrained by myth or statue, but alive in every home. Marriage, every wedding vow spoken. Beside fires, every promise of faithfulness and oath. She was the breath held between two joined hands, the look exchanged between bride and groom. She ruled not by decree, but by her endless observation, her silent insistence on respect and order in all things familial and divine. And as for Poseidon, his presence was not merely felt in crashing waves or raging storms, but in the soft undulations of the sea at sunset, in the slow recession of the tide, at dawn in the rhythmic pulse of ships gently rocking in harbor. He was fury and calm, tempest and tranquility. His trident was not merely a weapon, but a staff that stirred the balance of oceans, that parted waters, that inundated shores, and shaped the memory of lands near and far fishermen. Prayed to him not in fear, but in desperate hope for mercy, for bounty, for passage. Hades stood apart, yes, but his reign was not born of neglect, or, and what of, Athena born fully formed from Zeus' head, with shining armor and sharp mind her Apollo. His brother was the light of civilization, not just the sun in the sky. Aphrodite, with her soft gaze and alluring smile, was not confined, an Ares god of war blood-drenched. His role was never to make peace or to mete out justice. Hermes, ever-moving, ever-watching, danced between worlds, a trickster Demeter, arms full of wheat and sorrow within her, the rhythm of life and death, of famine and harvest. She gave to mortals the seasons and the myths that told their meaning her. Tears in winter, her smile in spring her, and Hephaestus bent over his forge. Smoke drifting off together, they became the 12, each unique, yet bound in divine tapestry. Their arguments were legendary, their alliances uneasy, yet from. Cities were built in their honor, not just in marble, but in mind. Philosophy arose from their stories, poetry from their passion, mathematics from their order, and rebellion from their contradictions, even those who began to doubt. Thus it was that the halls of Olympus ascended not alone among the clouds in the heavens above, but in the hearts of those who whispered prayers in the light of the fire or poured oil upon waters, still supposing that some way out of the veil of dawn and gauze of twilight the gods stirred with marvel and old-fashioned charm. And as the seasons changed in slow beat, so too changed the stories of these immortals, and unfolded again, spoken by wind and by waves, and by wandering poets who carried their poems along stone paths and sun-kissed shores. In the gold chamber where Zeus sat upon his throne far above the world, he looked out over the motionless earth. Below, as if it were sleeping child to be guarded, and in stillness, he was not just king of cloud and thunder, but breath of law, the hand of balance. And though his justice was awful, was this order that kept the 12, contained every god with his sphere, every power shaping the world, not into chaos. And the cities murmured her name in stone and law, in silence before war and after peace. And she stood wherever justice arose from knowledge, wherever courage was guided, not by rage, but by intellect, wherever minds strayed to shape the world as a work of clarity, not chaos. The scent of laurel carried prayer, half spoken, half prayed, and even those who did not practicing worship him felt his presence in stillness after illness, in warmth at sunrise, and the belief that each day starts with a promise, and not in end but into dance as ancient as the stars themselves. Every movement, recalling the first light that rent the sky asunder, was misconceived. She possessed the oldest truth of all, that desire carves out destiny, that longing weaves the road of nations, and that love in every shape. And though he was not seen, he was everywhere, in every tool, every wall, every fire, kindled with use and heat and breath and whisper, the one who could walk between all things, gods and mortals, dreams and death. And it was said that wherever something moved with purpose, or with intelligence, his sandals had been there first, and that wherever messages met or travelers exchanged tales, he had been listening just out of sight. And so he was the unobtrusive God, the one who built the world not by word or fiat, but by sweat and passion. He was the renewal that came after tyranny, the ecstasy that burst forth when silence became too ear-splitting, and he warned mortals and gods alike. But in tale, in sky, in the flash of imagination, in the silence, before thunder in the sparkle of dawn, on a quiet sea, and this was their eternal dominion, not by might, but by remembrance, not by throne, but by echo. And so their heritage traveled beside all who listened even faintly, even in slumber, that to lose oneself sometimes was not evil, but a sacred act of remembering that life was to be tasted and felt, and the slow beauty of something useful made from suffering. Of sea and every tale told, every breath spoken by moonlight or in temples, forgotten now and overgrown, was part of a living hymn, a song that never truly ends, but changes with each changing breath of time. With each indrawn whispered dream under the watch of stars is the soft strand that unites even the gods, even the rulers, from marble thrones and golden clouds from shadow. And his strength no longer resided in blind fury, but in the unnerving holiness of war, the understanding that through conflict something new could be brought into this world. And though feared, he was also held in awe, because war had not vanished, but evolved, and from this evolution he found a quieter glory, not of blood, but of transformation. Watchful eye and her touch was not only in the kill, but in the desire to protect, to preserve, to retain the untrained, and her command was not over man, but over the untainted spaces that required nothing of the world, but its mystery and balance in every shadow and dewdrop. Hera floated through the halls, like a warm summer breeze slow, and measured her eyes, knowing she knew her. Voice like rustling silk, and she was not strong in tempest or steel, but in marrying together the vows, the families, and even though her jealousy could move rivers and break crowns, she was also the echo of all marriage, the quiet presence at every hearth. And so her strength reached through the generations, not with the fire of war, but with the gentle heat of blood and inheritance. Poseidon, in his cavern dethroned, beneath the waves, still reverberated with tides and salt, but his temper was softened by centuries, and although sailors still spat up oblations in the foam for safe passage, they knew him as much as the great throb of the sea, the endless movement that rocked the cradle of life. And even when tempests were brewing sudden and riotous, they knew it not as cruelty, but as reminder that nature holds supremacy in water, never forgets its freedom. Athena stood upon the marble steps, a sentinel of thought, and order her gaze, never wavering her mind, ever spinning plots like yarn on a loom. Apollo walked the golden arc of the sky, not just as the sun, but as the beat behind music, the hand behind healing, the radiance of light that lit the fire of doubt. And in his temples, Artemis prowled the black forests with the quiet step of one destined for solitude, but never unaccompanied by the creatures of the wild, her only friend, the moon. Ares burned with the fire of constant fight, but now his yells were muffled like the air trapped in old helmets. Aphrodite drifted through the hearts of gods and mortals, her laughter hidden in petals, her voice in a lover's whisper. And although her domain Hephaestus remained in the burning forge beneath the hill, his hands bruised but trustworthy, his things as silent as prayers. Hermes blazed from place to place, his presence always transient, always swift, and still he was the god most similar wind. Dionysus laughed even among the untamed places where vines entwined and music overflowed his cup, filling his eyes aglow. And though the majority saw only madness in his wake, he was more than mere mayhem. And thus they stood not in stern majesty, but in ceaseless motion, gods of feeling and of remembrance, gods of light and silence, gods of order and of grace and of thunder. And even as empires rose and fell, although altars fell and scrolls were burned, the gods of Olympus stayed, not always in stone or temple. The Whispering Gods, a gentle pilgrimage through the myths and world of ancient Greece. Even today, when the wind blows across the tall grasses, when the sea boils and forgets its name, when the moon hangs low and bright over hills older than the story of them, it is not difficult to believe that somewhere out of reach the gods remain, whispering their legends in the ear of the dreaming, still waiting to be recalled in the still places between thunder and thought. For even when Olympus came high and bright, the shadows of ancient powers still rested, curled at the edges of light, for under every triumph there is a shadow of what has been lost, the buried titans, but not forgotten, the oldest shapes lingering still in caverns too, deep and shadows, the rivers that remember the fingers of nymphs and the mouths of lovers. Drowned in longing, even the underworld thuds with story, not silence, but thrumming with purpose. Hades sits not as villain, but as guardian, as one who understands the burden of what is to be guarded, what is not to return. For fire, the river of memory also flows backward as well as forward, and in it we find the forms of Nyx, the night whose wings bear up sleep and dream. Heracles with hands that smashed and hearts that broke with shame, his toils not penalty, but pilgrimage, each trial a shard of soul regained. Theseus following the thread, not only through some labyrinth of stone, but through the convolutions of self. With blessing Demeter waits for her sorrow, not spent but moderated by return in every promise sworn beneath stars. Hera hears her pride, her sorrow stored behind eyes that see all and judge kindly, or not at all in story. Perseus with his mirror shield not in order to avoid the Gorgon, but in order to see her otherwise, to reflect instead of incinerate, and Hypnos, whose touch closes the eyelids of kings as softly as petals fall, and Moros, who weaves the fates not with cruelty, but with the workings of things. His labyrinth not in fury, but in hunger for meaning, for light, for a stop to circular motion. So many created by curse, by we see both the hurt of desiring and the ecstasy of surrendering, but memory of pain, transmuted into strength of repudiation, transmuted into power of solitude, transmuted into something divine terror by the touch of gods who forgot their own power. And yet in all the tales, too, is the promise of forgiveness, the suggestion that what was broken and still sing his name not from fear, but reverence, aware that the deep is full of tales too long to be told tales. But purity, the rhythm of the world in distress, the cry of truth in times too, harsh for silence, and yet even he is not unyielding his rage, tempered by love for what he defends, by grief for what war takes away, by the secret understanding that even victory costs something only the waves know. Between stars and slumbering earth they survive in the questions that do and ask for answer, in the yearning that gives form to temples in the courage, now weathered by the hand of time, and olive trees still whispering in the rhythm of something old. The mortals who dwell under the gaze of the gods wake up to a world shaped not just by sun and earth. Came melodies that forged prophecy and healing poetry, and truth in every note was the hum of golden sunlight, the glow of dawn on sea. But in reverence fruit under statue songs to the air dances, duplicating the turning stars for the gods, were not remote forces. They were the breath within the breath, the dream within waking life, and it was Dionysus who reminded them madness and divinity wore the same face, the god of wine, of revelry, of separate, but part of a vast living design. Hermes, the messenger god with wings on his heels that raged like fire through the senses. Her love was not a gentle one. It was the foundation of creation and of destruction as well. With wrath and love and fate, Hector noble and destined to the fall of his city. Odysseus cunning of things into the spaces between lightning, into the quiet before the harvest, into the trembling of an open hand. Raised in prayer, a mirror of his mood, and yet he himself loved and hoped and lost the sea. Was not just his sword, his remembrances within his hand, and in his silence was peace, not fear. His name was not spoken lightly, not out of fear, but out of respect for the passage all would one day take, and in the dance of fire, in the goods buried with the dead, in the stone slabs that caught the sunlight his form, lingered like breath on frozen glass, smoothing it out, sowing seeds in the garden of imagination and belief for every story was a seed, and with every retelling it, we are never alone, and in the knowing there is peace and power and presence for the gods, who loved and feared and followed, and fell of the ones who spoke the words, and the ones who heard them of the world that was not made of stone, but of story and breath, and the gossamer thread that holds sky to sea, fire to shadow God the morning. It is the same song. It is always but a hymn for gods, and for us a lullaby, for a world perpetually becoming, perpetually remembering, perpetually reaching for something greater than sky, and greater than soul to mortal, and dream to dream. Do not die, they wait, they whisper and watch, they live, where belief is breath and story is soul. And in the voice that speaks these words, they return again to walk among us, as they always have, and always will grew altered, blossomed into something new for the gods. Were not unchanging, they shifted, they altered like light on water, reflecting what the people required, what they feared, what they desired. And the myths became cartographies, not of heaven, but of heart, mapping not the stars above, but the stars within the constellations of valor, of betrayal, of redemption and love. In the silence of time, still hearing, still remembering, still unfolding, but his home deep and unfathomable, full of things that had no name and dreams that eluded nets like silver fish. He was god of sailors, of fishermen, of those who were bold one. They were the creators of wonder and the reflection of our own depth, and in their worshipping, the Greeks worshipped themselves, their fears, their hopes, their desire for meaning, for beauty, for home. And in worshipping them, they made a mythology that would outlast empires, not because it was perfect, but because it was real in its own imperfection. Enough to leave dry land and have faith in the bob of salt and current, and in every wave that crashed on the shore, his voice could be heard, not in words, but in power. And so the world was a weaving of the seen and the unseen, a dance of human breath and divine intent, a turning as constant as the turning moon, and accursed, wandering through years and islands, searching not just for home, but for the lie behind the journey, each step echoing a choice by men and gods alike. Heracles, strong beyond measure, chastised and redeemed again and again his 12 labors, not trials, but mirrors reflecting the struggle within each heart to overcome the beast, to become something more, but purpose, the mind that had been tempered by challenge, the spirit that had been sharpened by debate, her wisdom, not given but gained by trial, by loss, by insight, and she lit the way by which civilization measured itself not in power but in reason, not in wealth but in justice, and so stood her temple not for herself, but for the idea that reason could rule the world, that thought could shape destiny. And in her shadow, philosophers spoke, artists carved, poets sang, and the city breathed like a living thought. She could build cities or fell kings, and yet in her presence there was ever the pull of something deeper, something older than mind, something like the ache in the heart when one sees the sun on the sea, and knows without reason that they are of it all. She was not kindness, she was not cruelty, she was truth, the truth of absence of form of the body, and the soul reaching ever for more. And cunning in his eyes, traversing worlds with emotions so fluid that silence was like a vow, he carried messages, but also souls guiding them over the threshold, between life and death, between one world and another. He was thief and guide, trickster and guardian, and in him the Greeks saw the thin line between chaos and harmony, between the wise and wicked, the moment undone. He came not with order, but with release. His cult was of thunder, not of war, but of ecstasy, of collapse into something more than thought, into frenzy. Into letting go in him, the vines thicken, and the night became a site of transformation, where masks drop and the soul is uncovered foam. He was Artemis' twin, she who moved like moonlight across the forest, her bow unwavering, her eyes sharp as obsidian. She was the huntress, the protector of the wild, and those who walk its quiet paths. She needed no temple but the canopy above, no crown but the silver curve of night. But by memory and presence, by the belief that the divine was never far away, only folded into the world like shadow into light, and so every echo on the breeze, every flicker on the flame, every ripple across the quiet surface of water carries upon it a story, a presence, a name from those who once trod not above, but among the people with feet that cut rivers and voices that bent the path of empires, that outlives fear in the voice, that speaks it over and over until the hearer becomes the teller and the teller the tale. The divine world is not merely Olympus, not merely the golden halls, but the borders, the margins, the woods, where Artemis runs barefoot in silence, the caves where Pan pipes his laughter into roots. But daily there caress in the rhythm of day and night, of light and dark, and in each in-between moment when the light is tempered, and the soul is just a little more vital. Here in the half-dark, between human and divine, Orpheus sang not to escape death, but to shape it into song, to entice beauty from sorrow. And though he turned too soon, his music endures in every song that dares hope against the end. And Persephone walks shadow with seeds in her pocket, her footsteps burgeoning into the seasons, her silence full of life, waiting to flower again and again. Even the monsters speak not of terror, but of being the Gorgon, who turned not in hatred, but in desperation, to stone the Minotaur walking. And the heroes, too, are part of this ceaseless whirling dance, children of gods, children of men, striding the edge of glory and sorrow. And yet, for every name remembered, there are 100 forgotten warriors, lovers, poets, who detected divinity in dreams, in war, in still moments of courage, lives that brushed the mythic, unconsciously left only in tatters and half-spoken songs in stones worn smooth by hands raised to the sky. In every village where a hearth fire glows, there is a survivor of Hestia, her warmth not high but steady, the center round which families revolve in every harvest, drawn together, and the sea never rests. Poseidon continues to shift in its breath, in the tug of tides, in the rage of storms, in the silence. After lightning flashes, and salt lingers in the air, and mariners whisper. The sky also shifts with Apollo and Artemis, twin energies of reason and lust. The sun a chariot drawn by flames, the moon a bow strewn with shadows, their power close at hand. Even the tricksters have a place. Hermes, whose laughter weaves together truths and untruths, whose feet rest in heaven and the dust of roads. He walks with thieves, with merchants, with messengers who bear not just words, but choices and dreams and transformation. He is God of thresholds, of movement, of stories just beginning, and stories all but told. Aphrodite still sachets around the world, not as beauty and form, but as desire, becoming as longing, burning, and healing, and goading creation. Itself her love, not plain, not gentle, but wild, and tempesting the power that is capable of moving seas, and crying open hearts, and in beholding herself reflected. Hephaestus, whose flame smolders not in Olympus alone, but in each hand that shapes in each artist, who seeps into clay, into fire, into metal, into art, his limp and not weakness. Ares, whose wrath is not madness. And Dionysus, who tears the world apart, not with destruction, but with revelation, whose madness is not absence of reason, but presence of a deeper sanity, the kind that lives in dance, in wine, in music, in the fierce breaking of boundaries, and the quick unmasking of the self beneath all disguises. The gods aren't memories that can be remembered. They are forces to be felt. They wake in wind and time, in blood and shadow. They are not absent. They are not past. They are woven into the very fabric of the world, into the space between heartbeat and breath, into the still, before a name is said, into the form of dreams and the quiver of hope. Thus the myths do not survive as records, but as echoes, as flame passed from hand to hand, as breath in dark rooms, as wonder. And perhaps that is the greatest gift the gods gave, not thunder, nor gold, nor even fate, but story, the unending unfolding, the construction of meaning from chaos, the transmogrification of pain into verse, the ability to name, and in naming to sanctify something mortal, something human, something divine. And so the legend endures today in whispers and stormy skies, in the hands that build and tear and build. Again, in every child who listens in wonder, in every elder who remembers the stars are not up there, they are within us, and every name we speak is a light rekindled. The wind blows slow like an old tune. Across time in stone fields, across temples among them, stood Apollo, the light that sang itself into existence, a god of many things. But first, and always a god of clear seeing and of sound, he carried his lyre as one carries, breath not separate from him, but an extension of him. And from its strings the crowd offered to them not in fear, and thus the myths never stood still, but grew like shoots on the tree of time, each one embracing another, each god not Aphrodite, born of sea foam and sky blood, not so much gentleness, but rather strength, the power of desire of beauty. From her stock, and from the mixing of gods and men, were born the heroes, each with the weight of blood that smoldered with eternity and decay. Achilles, swift and cursed son of sea and flame seething, and the humans did not forget their names. They built stories like buildings. They carried them in their breathing, in their bones, in their cradles and laws, and the gods themselves did not go away. They seeped into the folds. They told of how Poseidon stirred earth and sea with his trident, not just in anger, but in time, how each tide was a beat on his fingertips, every storm. They remembered how Hades ruled in the darkness, not as cruel, but as keeper of endings, as ruler of lost and forgotten, and remembered an escort of spirits. Through shadows he was not cruel. He was immovable, a figure that did not waver, that did not judge. He held the world, and so the gods remained not just in myth, but in symbol, not just in temples, but in the place. Between us and those spaces where music moves without birth, where dreams speak in foreign tongues, where we feel the weight of an unmade decision. But in offered, it was Athena who stood at the city's center, offering not merely protection. And yet the myths persisted like water, down a mountain road scoring out the earth around them. This is the reason why, even today, when the wind catches the trees, just so, or moonlight, slides across a face in silence, we recall something stirs in the blood. Not memory, but knowing we are not alone. And this is the myth not of gods, but of us, of the humans. Do you hear it anymore, the song that croons from marble? Ruins and broken pillars that winds in the cicadas and clings to olive leaves that hesitates in the stillness before. And now you are part of it too, wrapped in the voice and the breath, in the myth itself, carried like a name. The dawn rises again over the lands of Arcadia and Attica, and the soft breath of morning moves like a whisper through the olive groves, as if carrying the remnants of divine memory. The mortals stir from their sleep, and somewhere in their dreams still linger visions of gods, walking the earth not as strangers, but as kin, with voices like thunder and gazes that could summon storms or silence them with a single glance. Yet it is not fear that binds the humans to the gods. It is awe, a sacred trembling in the soul, as the shepherd watches the dew rise from the grass and imagines Apollo standing beyond the hills, his lyre catching the sunlight like golden threads strung between the heavens and the soil. Across the hills and temples etched with time, the myths continue to grow not in silence, but in the telling, as each voice that speaks them becomes a vessel of the old. Truth, the story of Demeter, who mourned the loss of her daughter Persephone to the underworld, and whose sorrow cast winter over the land. Each petal that fell, each frost that came, was her lament. And when Persephone returned each spring, it was not merely the changing of a season, but the renewal of a sacred cycle, a promise whispered between mother and child, between life and death, between above and below. This was not allegory. It was breath, it was rhythm, it was the world. Deep beneath the surface of the earth, where shadows bloom and silence is a living thing there, sat Hades, the unseen king, who ruled not with cruelty, but with stillness. The kind of authority that asked for no tribute and yet demanded reverence. His kingdom was one of memory of bones and endings, and yet it was not a place of despair, but of waiting of transformation. And so the dead did not cry out in agony. They rested wrapped in the folds of what once was held by the river Styx and ferried by the quiet hand of Charon, who asked for no more than a coin and offered in return a journey into eternity. And in the sky above all things, where light poured like honey from the sun, there stood Zeus not simply as a wielder of lightning, but as the echo of order, the one whose gaze kept the worlds from collapsing into chaos. His throne high upon Olympus was carved not just from cloud or marble, but from judgment and balance. His was not a power of unchecked wrath, but of deliberation. And though the Tales spoke of his tempests and desires, what lingered beneath those stories was the sense that even the king of gods was not free from the turning wheel of time, that his choices carried weight like mountains, and that his rule was a thread woven into the very fabric of the cosmos. Beside him sat Hera, his queen, not merely a figure of jealousy or vengeance, as the stories so often simplify, but a presence of quiet, strength of enduring dignity. She was the hearth of marriage and the protector of unions, the one who remembered the names of the forgotten, and who held the line when the heavens trembled with discord. In every ritual of betrothal, in every whispered vow there lingered her touch, not loud but firm, like a wind that carries you forward. Even when you wish to stop, she was the spine of Olympus, and without her the divine order would sag under its own weight. And there in the forge of volcano and fire stood Hephaestus the god who lent the god, whose hands shaped the armor of heroes and the thrones of immortals. He was not beautiful, but his craft was he was not swift, but his hands moved with a purpose that echoed deeper than time in every tool, in every weapon, in every chain. And every crown there was a trace of his breath, a soot of his labor, and mortals in need of strength, not of the sword, but of will, turned their eyes to the smoke, and found in its rising, shaped the courage to create, to endure, to transform. And if Hephaestus was the fire, then Athena was the steel born not in silence, but in a cry from Zeus' head. She came not as a daughter, but as wisdom itself, carved in form. Clothed in strategy and reason, her steps were measured, her gaze, unwavering in every act of clarity, in every battle not fought with muscle, but with mind. There stood Athena, and so she became the goddess of cities, of justice, of the art of war that did not destroy but protected. She was not thunder, she was the space between it. She was not law, she was the understanding that made law necessary. And her temple stood in Athens not merely as stone and column, but as the body of memory and thought. And the myths unfolded further, not like pages, but like waves folding into one another, until each name became not just a god, but a symbol, a breath, a force within and beyond. And so the Greeks walked among temples, not as monuments to power, but as mirrors to the soul, for each god they honored revealed a part of themselves, and in doing so they remembered that to live was not just to breathe, but to feel, to worship was not just to bow, but to belong, and that somewhere, in the wind between mountain and sea, the gods listened still. The gods were felt in the rustling leaves, the murmur of streams, the crackle of fires, and the hush of moonlight on cool stone, in the turning of seasons, the blooming of flowers, the fall of rain, and the rise of the sun. The gods were not distant rulers, but intimate forces woven into every breath, every heartbeat, every step the people took between earth and sky, between past and future. And though their tales were old, their voices never faded, carried on the lips of poets, whispered in the prayers of the faithful, sung in the choruses of festivals. Their stories became the very fabric of culture, the rhythms of daily life, the colors of hope and fear and love woven tight into the tapestry of human existence. The gods were not only in myth, but in memory, in the way the world moved, and in the way the heart remembered to dream. They were the breath that stirred the soul, the spark that ignited courage, the shadow that deepened mystery, the light that revealed truth, and in their eternal dance, the mortals found meaning, a language without words, a presence without form, a song without sound that carried them forward through time, through struggle, through joy, and through the quiet moments when the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next story to begin. The dawn rises again over the lands of Arcadia and Attica, and the soft breath of morning moves like a whisper through the olive groves, as if carrying the remnants of divine memory. The mortals stir from their sleep, and somewhere in their dreams still linger visions of gods, walking the earth not as strangers, but as kin with voices like thunder and gazes that could summon storms or silence them with a single glance. Yet it is not fear that binds the humans to the gods. It is all a sacred trembling in the soul, as the shepherd watches the dew rise from the grass and imagines Apollo standing beyond